Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and hugs to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you, as always. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, but yes, doing very well. And I'm so delighted to be with you in the second part of our story today, because I don't know about you, but I just adore these stories. I love all the characters and also the Bigfoot encounters, which are very exciting. So before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with our story.
You need to stay here, sweetheart. Watch over the body of Mr. Reynolds, my husband told me. I'm going to go back to the house to park the ATV in the garage and to put the plastic tarpaulin sheet away. Then I will call the police. I will say we didn't take our cell phones with us on our walk. So I told you to stay with the body while I went to call them for help. I'll be the one that chaperones the police directly to the woods to show them where the body of Mr. Reynolds can be found. If you could scatter some of those leaves that have been shifted by the sheet we moved, that would look a whole lot better. We don't want to look like we moved the body ourselves, do we?
But do you have to go? Can't I come back with you? I said, not liking the idea of being left on my own in the woods.
No, sweetheart, you stay here. It's much better that way. I won't be very long. I will need to show the police where the body is when they arrive at the inn. I will tell them I've left you watching over it. Remember our stories. We mustn't contradict each other. We went for a walk together in the woods, and were very shocked to stumble across the deceased body of Mr. Reynolds. We think he must have suffered from a heart attack. We don't know very much about the man, other than he's from Queens in New York, and his wife Molly died 5 years ago, and his daughter lives in Ireland, and is married with 3 grown-up children that have now left home. Understood? That's all we know.
I nodded rather reluctantly, feeling a terrible sense of guilt for having moved Mr. Reynolds' body in the first place. But we really didn't need the wrong kind of publicity for our inn, before we'd even established a good name for ourselves. I hoped what I'd done didn't make me a bad person in any way. It would seem 13 was definitely an unlucky number for us, as Mr. Reynolds was our 13th guest. He had died in the living room at our inn. Why was 13 so unlucky for me? Fine, I'll stay here then. But for goodness sake, please don't be long. Of course, I understood that it made perfect sense for my husband Jordan to go back to the White Owl Inn, to call the emergency services, and then to chaperone the police to where Mr. Reynolds' body could be found. But I, for one, didn't like hanging around the deceased corpse, waiting for my husband's soon return. I began to awkwardly shift leaves around the path, removing any tread marks that had been created by the ATV, so the ground itself looked reasonably undisturbed. It was a beautiful morning. The pretty sunlight spilled magnanimously through the woodland canopy, while creeping ferns, shrubs, and flowering shade-loving plants eagerly cascaded on the forest floor in a tangled confetti of prepossessing foliages. The plants lapped up the spring sunshine almost as greedily as I did. I was enjoying the congenial warmth that brushed against my shoulders and face. It certainly wasn't easy to appreciate this idyllic setting right now, in which I stood, where a lone squirrel had stopped nibbling its acorn on a tree branch and appeared to be staring at me rather curiously through its very dark, soulful eyes. And then it hurriedly scurried away. It seemed like all the beauty of this beguiling morning had been cruelly lost by the rather harrowing sight of Mr. Reynolds' deceased corpse that had put a damper on everything. In truth, the corpse was beginning to look like a mannequin, lying there over a plethora of leaves, with eyes fixed and vacant. I noticed Mr. Reynolds' mouth was hanging open, as if he was yawning rather widely. I had wanted to close the man's eyes and mouth to make him look more dignified in death, but my husband Jordan had wisely insisted that we must have as little contact with the dead body as possible, and I suppose that made perfect sense. We needed to leave him be, but I did replace the glasses on his face, as it would have looked rather odd if he had not been wearing them. It was after my husband had left the woodgrove that I noticed the bird song in the forest had become strangely mute, Everything was dauntingly quiet, so much so that I could actually hear a pin drop. I had walked into this wood grove on a plethora of occasions, and never known it to feel so unsettling like this. Every part of my body wanted to run away from the woods as fast as I possibly could, and return to the safety of the White Owl Inn, because something felt seriously off. I knew I couldn't leave the wood grove. I had resolutely given my husband my solemn word that I would stay here faithfully in the woods, as I awaited his arrival with the police. It was the least I could do in the circumstances. My husband had agreed to move Mr. Reynolds' body, even though it was against his will to do so. I think Jordan understood that running the White Owl Inn had been a dream of mine, and the last thing we needed was a story to circulate around the entire town about a death in the inn, as an event like this would surely sabotage our business. Even if I was wrong about this, as far as I was concerned, it was so much better to be safe than sorry. It was when I heard the ponderous footsteps thumping across the forest floor and moving towards me that my heart almost stopped beating. Someone was coming, and it couldn't have been my husband, because they were walking in the opposite direction to where he'd gone, and furthermore my husband wouldn't be back this quickly. Whoever they were whistling contentedly to themselves. I do remember Mr. Reynolds telling me, shortly before I retired to bed that night, that he'd been certain that on an afternoon casual walk in the wood grove he had been sure he was being watched, and that someone was stalking him. I had thought the old man delusional. Now I was not so sure. Maybe someone had been spying on him after all. I knew unequivocally someone was coming my way. That was without doubt. It occurred to me that a vagrant could be camping in our wood grove, even though it was still rather chilly. And what if he wasn't right in the head? Some mentally ill, disturbed people lived on the streets. Everyone knew that. They camped out in the wilderness at times, and our wood grove would be the perfect place to hide. Let's just say here in Vermont, unknown to a lot of tourists that come to this part of the world, there has been an underbelly of crime that has been clandestinely hidden from all visitors, as none of the locals want their businesses to be affected negatively by any unsavory decay that has taken hold here in Vermont. But then again, all over North America, there are pockets of crime, wherever you look. Let's just say I have heard of people being killed in cold blood by armed robbers who are looking for resources to support unbridled drug habits. So was I a little alarmed that the person coming my way might not be of sound mind? Of course I was. On one occasion, over a year ago, I had fortuitously stumbled across some used needles here in the woods, along with an old sleeping bag lying snagged among some bushy brambles, not to mention quite a few bottles of alcohol that were now all empty. First and foremost, whoever was walking around in the woods right now, whistling to themselves nonchalantly, he or she was definitely trespassing. It was these disquieting thoughts that promptly persuaded me to hide behind a tree, as I heard the person's approach. I knew when the police came to remove the deceased body of Mr. Reynolds from the forest floor, I would tell them that someone illegal was hanging about our property, and hopefully they would tell the man, him or her, to go at once, although I hoped they wouldn't be accused of a crime they did not commit. But then again the autopsy would reveal that Mr. Reynolds' death was due to natural causes, I assured myself. The footsteps got uncomfortably closer and closer. I decided the person coming my way was very definitely of a hefty build and robust stature, because the ground heaved, groaned, and vibrated under their powerful weight and beneath their solid boots. I could hear the snapping of twigs and branches, the rustling of leaves. A lighter person wouldn't make such a disturbing noise. What happened next blew my brains almost out of my head, as if someone had pulled the trigger and fired a bullet into my head. If I had thought Mr. Reynolds was delusional when he thought someone had been following him around the woods the day prior, I was now seriously beginning to think that I was the one in serious jeopardy, because what I was seeing with my naked eyes just could not be real. I rubbed my eyes impulsively, as if willing away the build-up of cobwebs that were clearly distorting my vision. Yet I knew what I was seeing was not a figment of my imagination, but how I wished it was. At first I observed a lofty dark silhouette emerging through the foliage onto the walking trail. It was on closer scrutiny and examination that the ambiguous shadowy figure began to take a solid form, while my eyes adjusted to what I was seeing. It was almost like my mind refused to agree with my eyes, and they were challenging each other in an open but argumentative debate. My eyes were saying to my mind, "This is real," but my mind was saying, "No, it's not." In the end, my eyes won out, the battle of doubt, that is, because I knew what I was seeing was real. There was no doubt. There he was, standing on the woodland trail, a Herculean-sized male Bigfoot. Moments later, a female joined him from behind. I was naturally surprised by this. I was so sure I had only heard one set of feet moving through the trees. The male Bigfoot looked confounded, somewhat bemused, when he stared down at the deceased corpse of Mr. Reynolds. He stood there solemnly, while a sausage-sized finger of his began to scratch his head, as though he was locked deep in thought, like someone trying to resolve a rather awkward problem. I don't believe for a single second that he was best pleased to see a deceased corpse on the footpath. The female stood at his side, equally as bemused. Two of them began to talk to each other, backwards and forwards in an earnest conversation. I knew they were discussing Mr. Reynolds' corpse, as if it presented a major problem for them, as it had done for me in my living room. I noticed the male Bigfoot was much, much larger than the female, by at least a couple of feet, and he was twice as wide as her. He was so much more densely muscular than she was. But they were both, without any doubt, absolutely enormous in girth and height, covered in dark brown hair, similar in colour to a black bear. Most disturbing of all was how human their faces actually were, and how incredibly intelligent they seemed. "Tulokati, hakila koto, amakata, oloboni."
"Ah, vinatala, hoshakatilada, hokulibadi, hamatali nugo, akisa, atilakani, okuliba, ah, shinatwa." At one point I thought my cover might be blown, when the female Bigfoot pointed towards the tree, where I was hiding, and appeared to be saying something to the male Bigfoot. "Kalikati, atilakati no kolopo, ani, asaka." The male looked towards the tree where I was hiding, and appeared to be shaking his head rather vigorously. What that meant, I had no idea. Did the Bigfoot know that I was hiding in their midst? Did they both know? I began to inwardly panic, as I was terrified of how these creatures might react if they were to see me. To all intents and purposes, if the Bigfoots knew I was there, they chose to ignore me and leave me well alone, which is something I was eternally grateful for. I certainly didn't fancy a close-up encounter with either one of them, especially as they were the most intimidating creatures I have ever beheld. I would likely faint from the shock. Even my legs seemed to be crumbling beneath me, just from observing them from a vantage point. The two imposing, very formidable-looking Bigfoots seemed to be arguing among themselves for a while, much like me and my husband Jordan had done earlier on in the living room. "Kitani kali koto matilati, ogonapa, hilati lakwa, himpotono, pilati kakulokotona, akina, ah manita, hikotoloban." What happened next completely took me off my guard. The male Bigfoot squatted onto his large knees and then threw Mr. Reynolds' body over his shoulders like a very small sack of potatoes, and then began to walk away, with the female Bigfoot at his side, while he continued to whistle happily to himself, and finally they were gone from my sight. And so was the deceased body of Mr. Reynolds, I'm afraid. What were they going to do with him? Please God, they weren't going to eat him, were they? I immediately ran out of the woodgrove, waiting for the police to arrive, because there was no way on God's earth I could tell them what I'd seen. It was better, so much better, to pretend that I was as confounded as they were about the disappearance of Mr. Reynolds' body, when they discovered it was all but missing. There are some things you would be wise not to talk about. I'd almost made my way back to the White Owl Inn when I saw my husband Justin talking to two uniformed officers. I observed a police car parked in our driveway,
along with an ambulance, where 2 ambulance EMTs were chatting away together.
"Oh, there she is,"
said my husband, unable to disguise the frown on his face.
"I thought I told you to stay with the body, love. What are you doing here?"
"I didn't want to stay with it. I'm sorry, I couldn't do it. It freaked me out. It gave me the creeps." One of the officers, a man with silvery hair, looked at me kindly.
"Ma'am, that's perfectly understandable in the circumstances. Some people are not remotely comfortable around the dead. You can stay here at the inn if you like, while me and your husband go and observe this body you're talking about. What exactly happened, ma'am?" he asked me. "Can you tell me everything you know about your guest staying with you at the White Owl Inn? Anything you can tell us will make our jobs a whole lot easier."
The officer's direct questioning took me rather by surprise. "Well, he's a very sweet man, officer. Well, he was a sweet man, put it that way. But he was very sad, if you know what I mean." The officer pulled out a black spiral-bound notebook and a pen from his pocket and scribbled down a few notes rather hurriedly.
"Sad, ma'am? What do you mean by sad? Are you saying he was suicidal or something?"
"No, nothing like that. Well, at least I don't think so. His wife Molly died 5 years ago, you see, from breast cancer. His daughter, who's in her 50s, is living in Ireland, I believe, with her husband, and she has 3 grown-up kids. He has no family living here in America. He was telling us last night over dinner how lonely he gets at times, and how he couldn't bring himself to throw out his wife's clothing, because then he had to admit to himself that she was really gone. He said he wished he'd gone first before she did, because he finds life a struggle without her. But that doesn't mean he's suicidal. He's just sad, melancholic, I think."
"That is very sad indeed. So you don't think the man was suicidal, or attempted to take his life, do you, ma'am?"
"Absolutely not. I very much doubt that."
"I have to say it's never easy for the one left behind to pick up the pieces of their lives after a spouse has died. What was his full name, ma'am? Do you know how old he actually was?"
"Well, I do know his name was Ian Reynolds, and that he turned 85 on the 23rd of April. So his birthday was about 2 weeks ago, wasn't it?" The officer continued to scribble down some notes.
"I'm very impressed with you, ma'am, that you know so much about your guest staying with you. I have to say not many people in your line of business can tell us very much about the people staying with them. Do you know where Mr. Reynolds was from by any chance? Anything you can tell me will be enormously helpful."
"Well, I know he was from Queens, officer. Queens in New York, if that helps. I'm sure his ID and stuff like that is in his bedroom suite here at the inn, and of course you're welcome to look through any of it. Hopefully you'll find all the contact details you're looking for, especially of his daughter on his cell phone, because I'm sure she needs to hear about his tragic passing."
"I'll do that after I've seen the body for myself. Did Mr. Reynolds, ma'am, look as if he was ill last night in any way? Sick, perhaps?"
"No, absolutely not, officer. I think if he were feeling under the weather, he'd have mentioned something about it."
It was my husband who interjected. "Officer, how can I put it to you? Mr. Reynolds was a quiet, reticently reserved, rather demure man. A perfect gentleman, you could say. My wife here, she's very, very good with people. Always has been. She really made Mr. Reynolds feel right at home. He opened up to her last night over the dinner table. So we learnt a significant amount about him. So you say over dinner he was absolutely fine. He didn't complain of any headaches, feeling peaky, heart palpitations perhaps?"
"No, nothing like that, officer. And he had quite an appetite on him, I assure you of that. I remember he had 3 roast potatoes, plenty of chicken, some cheesy grits and cornbread, and that was followed by some apple fritters, and he had second helpings of those."
"Sounds to me, ma'am, that you're quite the cook," said the officer, flashing me a warm, approving smile.
"Well, I try my best, officer," I said, blushing.
"So he ate rather well. What time did he retire to bed last night, ma'am?"
"Well, he didn't, officer. That's the point. He was in the living room, sitting on the sofa, reading a Dick Francis book. He told me how much he loves the author Dick Francis. I asked him if he'd like a hot chocolate or something, and he said that would be nice. And that was when I brought him a cocoa. We spoke a little together, and then I turned in for the night, leaving him behind sitting on the couch in the living room. After that I have no clue. Your guess is as good as mine."
"What did you speak about, ma'am, before you returned to bed that night? Do you remember? It might be of interest."
"Nothing really, officer. But he did say that on a walk in the woodgrove that afternoon, he felt as if he was being stalked. That got my attention, let me tell you." At this the officer looked quite interested and scribbled down some more notes.
"Ma'am, when you saw his deceased corpse in the grove, it's very important. Was he wearing last night's attire on his person, or a fresh set of clothes that he possibly put on this morning? That might suggest he left the property this morning for a walk, or he could have had a walk after he spoke to you last night. That's what I'm trying to guess."
"Well, he was wearing the clothes he'd worn at dinner," I told the officer truthfully.
"Is there a possibility, ma'am, that Mr. Reynolds could have taken a walk in the woods at night after you retired to bed?"
"Well, that's what I'm saying. It's a possibility. But remember, it would have been very dark, and I saw no flashlight with the body, so I assume he might have taken a walk early this morning," I lied.
"Do you know, ma'am, if Mr. Reynolds spoke of any health issues that he might have been having, like high blood pressure or something? Do you know if he was on any medications, perhaps?"
"Well, he never mentioned anything to me. Apart from his emotional state, of course. Mr. Reynolds is a fit man, officer. He walks a great deal, apparently, and travels rather frequently to places he's been with his wife. He'd come here to Stowe regularly during the winter, when he was younger, to go skiing with his wife. He likes coming back to places that are rather nostalgic for him. I can assure you, officer, Mr. Reynolds was lean and reasonably fit. I had no reason to doubt that he was in good health."
"Thanks, ma'am. You've been remarkably helpful, very informative. You can stay here if you like, ma'am, while I go into the woods with the EMTs and the other officer, with your husband, of course, to locate the body. Once we've established he's dead, then we'll call the coroner."
I watched my husband talking with the two officers as they, along with the EMTs, all walked into the grove together. I decided I wouldn't even tell my husband about the Bigfoot I'd encountered. I wondered how the officers would react when they could not find Mr. Reynolds' deceased body. But there was no way that I was ever going to tell them what had really happened. I didn't want them to look at me as if I'd lost leave of my senses and belonged in a funny farm. When the officers came back from the woods and were sashaying down the driveway, they were talking earnestly with my husband. I knew something was up. The EMTs got back into their ambulance and drove away. The two officers were led into the house by my husband. They went upstairs to search through Mr. Reynolds' stuff in his bedroom, bathroom, en suite, to look for his ID, I suspect.
"You won't believe it, Kimmy,"
said my husband, when he came downstairs to see me. I could see he was bursting to tell me the news.
"Kimmy, something really weird has happened."
I raised a brow, premeditatedly, of course, and said, "What do you mean, weird?"
"The body of Mr. Reynolds has vanished. It's nowhere to be seen. It's not in the grove anymore. Do you realize what I'm saying, Kim? Mr. Reynolds' body has gone. It's vanished, disappeared into thin air."
"You mean it's not there anymore?" I asked, pretending to be very surprised.
"That's exactly what I mean, Kimmy. We couldn't find the body anywhere. How can it vanish like that? The mind just boggles. The officers are going to recruit some dogs and a search team to try and find the location of the body. It can't have got terribly far. But something or someone has moved it. Can you bloody believe that, Kimmy?"
"Gone? But how can that be?" I said.
"That's what the officers are trying to establish," said my husband.
It was a long day for us at the White Owl Inn, as officers arrived on the scene, and the woodgrove on our property was thoroughly searched. But even the dogs failed to pick up the scent of Mr. Reynolds. The dead body could not be found anywhere. But it was 2 days later that my husband got a phone call from an officer concerning the investigation, who informed us on what was going on.
"Good news, Mr. Viceroy. The body of Mr. Reynolds has been recovered, I'm glad to say. It's a huge relief for all of us at the Sheriff's County Office. It has been found. my husband asked. Where was it found? It was found about 24 hours ago. A farmer who lived a 2-hour drive away from you, to be exact. He was out in his field and noticed the body slumped against the barbed wire fence. He said it wasn't there the day prior, so someone had to have dumped it there and moved the body so far away from your woods. It's extraordinary, especially as the person who dumped the body would have had to climb over barbed wire fences. Those things can tear you to shreds, believe me, if you're not careful. We got our forensic team to look for any evidence, but we only found a few black hairs on his person that they couldn't identify as being totally human. We did an autopsy as quickly as we could, and given autopsy results can take weeks and weeks, we were very lucky indeed on that score. The coroner was very obliging to proceed with things very urgently. We needed to establish as quickly as possible that there was no foul play concerning Mr. Reynolds' untimely death, and we wanted to establish that he hadn't committed suicide. So we did a series of toxicology tests. Off the record between you and me, you'll be glad to know, Mr. Viceroy, the autopsy confirmed what you and your wife believed happened to the old man. It would seem that your guess that he had a massive coronary arrest while taking a stroll in the woodgrove is accurate. The coroner believes he died between 10 o'clock at night to about 5 this morning, so maybe he did go for a morning walk. I have to say that despite your saying that Mr. Reynolds looked as fit as a fiddle, when the coroner opened him up, she was surprised he hadn't died years before. He had so much arterial plaque inside him, it isn't even true. It was one of the worst cases she'd ever seen in her entire life. It just goes to show the outside does not always reflect the inside, because by all accounts you described your guest to be a very fit, healthy man. But it would seem he was anything but. He was fit, officer. I'm surprised his body was in a bad way. I wouldn't have expected that. Why do you think the body was moved from our woods, officer, to so far away? I have no idea, Mr. Viceroy. Your guess is as good as mine. I recall your wife said that Mr. Reynolds claimed to believe someone had been stalking him on a walk in the grove. Maybe that someone saw him dropping down dead and tried to remove the body, in case their DNA was found in the woods, perhaps on a bottle or something. They were probably concerned about this. They didn't want to be falsely accused of his death. It's just a thought. You'll be surprised what people will do to protect themselves from police scrutiny, Mr. Viceroy. But the autopsy results do not lie. I will say that finding Mr. Reynolds' body so far from where you both reside is extraordinary. If I didn't know any better, I would say he had been teleported from one destination to another. It's a very strange, peculiar case. But in my line of work, nothing surprises me anymore. And I've learnt that sometimes answers to enigmatic questions will never ever be found. So what are you going to do now, officer? Asked my husband. Well, you know the usual. We're going to have to get in touch with his daughter in Ireland to tell her the tragic news. It's part of my job. I don't enjoy it, but it has to be done. As I correctly anticipated, there was an article in the press written about the rather peculiar case. Thankfully, no attention was drawn to the White Owl Inn. I was grateful for that. The article simply stated, "An 85-year-old man by the name of Ian Reynolds from Queens, New York, was sadly found lying dead in a woodgrove close to the town of Stowe by 2 people who own an inn in the area, taking a casual morning stroll, who stumbled accidentally upon the corpse. Mr. and Mrs. Viceroy discovered the body lying on a random footpath and immediately called the police to notify them of this. But when the police arrived on the scene and went to locate the body, it had all but mysteriously disappeared. The body was found 2 days later, lying in a farmer's field." Farmer Bryce Easterman told the Herald, "I was on the field a day prior, on the back of my tractor. Had the deceased corpse been there at the time, I would have seen it at once. It would have been extremely difficult to miss." It would seem the body had been moved to Bryce Easterman's field, which is 2 hours away from Stowe, which left officers very befuddled. A coroner's report has confirmed that Mr. Reynolds died of a massive heart attack, so foul play in connection to his untimely passing has been ruled out. As to why Mr. Reynolds' body was moved in the first place in such an inexplicable way, without receiving any after-death scratches, given the large amount of barbed wire fences that ultimately would needed to have been crossed to get to Farmer Bryce's field, is nothing short of extraordinary, leaving behind more questions than answers. Some people believe the mysterious disappearance of Mr. Reynolds has got something to do with UFO activity in the area. One woman living close to the inn has claimed she's seen strange lights coming from those woods. I think Mr. Reynolds was abducted. He was taken up into a spaceship. And once they did all that, bodies, whatever they do to bodies, well, then they just discarded him, didn't they? It's not surprising he was found 2 hours away from Stowe, if you ask me. It is certain that the area is a hive of UFO anomalies. Mr. Ian Reynolds leaves behind a daughter who lives in Ireland with her husband and 3 adult grandchildren. The daughter was naturally devastated to learn about her father's passing. Jennifer Braxton described her father as one of the most gentle souls you can ever hope to meet. She intends to fly over to America to make funeral arrangements for her father in the next couple of days. As I reflected over the article and remembered how the Bigfoots had ferried the body of Mr. Reynolds away, only to place it in a farmer's field 2 hours away from Stowe, where it could easily be found, left me with only one swift conclusion. The Bigfoots did not want the dead body to draw attention to the woods on our property, where maybe they choose to hang out. Far from wanting to eat the body, they had simply removed it to another location. I decided this would be a secret I wouldn't ever share, not even with my husband, only because if he told me the same unlikely story, I would have a hard time believing it, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life persuading him that it had happened. So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.